Welcome back to another episode of Insights with Experts, where we aim to encourage and foster discussion, learning, and creating an informed global community. To view this and other interviews in detail, head over to theseer.org, linked in the description. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to our channel for constant updates. Enjoy the episode.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Insights with Experts. Joining us here today, we are very fortunate to have Miss Angelita Teo. Now, Angelita is the current director at the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage at the International Olympic Committee. Angelita, it's absolutely wonderful to have you here. How are you?
Wonderful. It's spring, although it doesn't feel like spring, but at least spring is here. It's been a long winter this year.
Of course. So also with us, taking this interview will be Morgan. So Morgan will be taking the second half of this interview, and he is a current French and English student at Cardiff Uni. Morgan, how are you?
I'm good, thank you, Sean, mate. How about yourself?
Yeah, not bad, thank you. The first question we would like to ask you is essentially, could we get an overview of what you do?
In fact, everything kind of happened by coincidence, I think. It wasn't really planned that way. Being Asian, as you can tell, and growing up in Asia, it was quite typical for families to want you to be an engineer, a doctor, and so on. Going into the arts was not something that I was particularly keen. I was exposed to be honest, from a young age. So when I went to the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in the 90s, I was supposed to do mass communication, which was really popular in those days. But I actually took an elective class in archaeology and fell in love with it. And because there wasn't social media and things weren't as easy in terms of contacting your parents, I changed my major and everything without telling my mom, actually. And largely because I felt that this was something I wouldn't have been able to do in Singapore. That's where I'm from. And with that, I think it started my journey in the arts and cultural landscape. And I was also extremely fortunate when I graduated and was back in Singapore. It was also a period of time where Singapore was developing the arts. So there was a lot more government investment. There were a lot of new positions coming out. And so I got myself into the National Heritage Board and started working as an assistant curator at the Asian Civilization Museum. So that's how I started my career. And I guess I never looked back from there. And from museums to festivals, that's been my exposure for the last 20 over years. And it's really about bringing the arts, bringing culture to people, creating exciting experiences and conversations among people. And you realize that the word people comes up a lot. And actually, I think it's really about that, wanting to be able to work in a field where you're constantly interacting with people in one way or another. That really, really excites me.
So with all this information that's so easily accessible, what do you see the role of museums? What do you think the role of museums will play in this future where information can be accessed so easily?
I think museums play a very central role in a community. And I think a lot of museums are moving in that direction in terms of being relevant to the community that it serves. In other words, unlike the large, encyclopedic museums like, the Louvre or the British Museum, where they are definitely catering to, tourists and large numbers. I'm not saying that they don't think about things like that, but most city museums, since we were talking about British Museum, a good comparison is the Museum of London, for example. What they are doing and what they are thinking is about engaging with people within the city of London. And how do you create opportunities for conversation? So museums can be seen as civic spaces for dialogues among people, a space where sometimes you can handle very difficult conversations as well, in a kind of a safe space. The role of the museum in terms of exhibitions, putting up programs, is to create interest in relevant topics of the moment. because as you know, with social media, with the internet, we are constantly having a information overload. How do you get people to spend a couple of hours, I guess, just being interested in one topic that's relevant at that point? So curators today do not curate exhibition based on their own interests, nor their field of research or what the collection is, but very often they are curating exhibitions that is relevant to today's context. So I'll give an example. At the Olympic Museum, for example, because of the pandemic, last year we came up with a small exhibition, but a quite last minute in reaction to it. And it was to actually talk about the Antwerp Games in 1920. As you know, that was in the early 1900s, we had the Spanish flu, and the 1920 was actually the first games where the Spanish flu was kind of over, I guess, and that actually is extremely relevant in today's context to talk about these things, that history in a way is repeating itself, but what can we learn from history that we can apply to today? So in fact, that exhibition came about last minute, but it received extremely good feedback, and in fact schools were visiting it online as well, just to have I guess important discussions with their pupils as well. So exhibitions and museums, I feel, are places where we can create curiosity, and we can create shall I say, individual interest in something that you're not aware of, and hopefully you can spend a couple hours Googling and try and find out more on your own. Yeah.
And what this next question essentially is, so what I've seen myself in Australia is we're seeing the role of the state. What is trying to happen is they're trying to influence students. They're trying to incentivize students to move away from arts courses and go over to more STEM-based science courses. And I wanted to ask you what you thought the implications of this actually will be. I mean, do you think we're going to get anywhere in the future by, I guess, using stick and carrot incentives like this to determine students' courses? Or do you think we should really try and intrinsically motivate students instead?
I think that education is not confined to just official institutions like a university or schools. I think education happens all the time around us, and I think to be quite fair to, I can't speak for whole of Australia, but I know you are in Melbourne. But for example, the Victoria government is extremely supportive of the arts. The amount of money they are putting into creating exciting spaces like South Bank and so on is to really push to have a more well-rounded society. I think there are instances where university can fulfill a certain role, and you need a formal education, to be an engineer, to be an architect, and things like that. But you can still enjoy arts on the side, and there are a lot of people as a second career, or even while being a lawyer, as an artist at the same time. And I think the way the world is now, you can be more than one thing at one time, and I think that's quite exciting. In fact, for us now, we are promoting a lot of Olympians who are not just athletes, but they are artists as well. So we have Olympians who are photographers, who are painters, and all that. So we wanted to show that people can be extremely multifaceted in that sense. And I think the reality is you still need the sciences, the technology, and all of that STEM stands for. But I mean, there are also a lot of conversation about STEAM as well, putting art right in the middle of that whole conversation. And I think that's something worth thinking about, but I don't think it needs to be a formal education unless you're really into it. But I think there are other ways of being able to be exposed to the arts and being inspired by the arts to be a better engineer, for all yeah.
And so with that, I would just like to ask you one final question, because I imagine many of the students that are going to be watching this would be currently taking an arts course now. And I wanted to ask, as someone who's done very well, came as an art student, what advice would you have for art students moving into the remainder of the 21st century? And essentially, how can they find their place in a world that is apparently going to be so overwhelmed by STEM?
I think one of the most important thing in as a person is to be quite adaptable and flexible. You will come out of school having a certain ideal, thinking about how you would spend, how you lead your life after graduation. But sometimes, as the saying goes, right, if you get thrown lemons, make lemonades. So you have to be reactive. You have to be open-minded enough that whenever you encounter a door, even though you don't think that this is something for you, open it, have a look before you decide to close that door. And I think that's something that sometimes I find that people who are extremely committed to one thing, they feel that it's only that one thing that will be meaningful to them. But the ability to say no, let's have a look at other things as well, and then I'll decide, even after leaving school. Because an education in a university is just to expose you to certain skills. It doesn't really determine that you definitely have to go down a particular route. I have a lot of lawyer friends who leave university and never practice a day, but they become open wonderful businesses, restaurateurs and so on. So I think just keeping an open mind and not being afraid to do something you're unfamiliar with, or to be exposed to new things.
Now I'm going to ask you my first question. In your role as the director of the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage, you've obviously been able to travel extensively, experience a wide range of sports. Would you say it's almost been the ideal job for yourself?
Hope you're enjoying the episode so far. To learn more about Orakui, as well as more information about our upcoming episodes, don't forget to follow our socials for constant updates and education content. Links are always in the description. I
have to say that in my previous job, I traveled extensively. I arrived in Lausanne right before the COVID-19, and I had 5 months and I was locked down since. So I have not traveled since. This is the first time I've not traveled for this long. In the museum world, we travel a lot because we do a lot of collaboration with other museums, cultural institutions, and because I do festivals as well. I visit a lot of festivals around the world, like Nuit Blanche in Paris once a year, or Fête des Lumières in Lyon once a year as well. So there had been a lot of traveling for the arts, not so much for the sports, simply because I came and I got locked down, and my first real trip out will be to Tokyo in about 2 months' time. And before that, I only managed to visit Tokyo once before all air travel stopped. But to answer your question about sports, I think it's quite amazing from someone from the arts to join sports, because sports is so much. It has such a big audience, much bigger audience than the arts can ever imagine. So for me, one of the reasons I took on this job was the international exposure, of course, not just doing something in Singapore, but everything that we talk about today is about the world. It's about reaching out to a global audience. It's talking about how do you convert art enthusiasts to be also Olympic supporters. You have to understand one thing about the Olympics. It's more than sports. Sports is one aspect of the Olympic Games, but it's really the values that it brings, hope, peace, and of course, the respect, friendship, and excellence. All these things are Olympic values, as we call them. And these are things that I feel that for someone in the arts and culture, is extremely exciting to be able to promote it, whether it's through culture or through sports. Yeah.
On that idea, do you feel that there's a certain different appreciation of sports through the arts with different cultures around the world? Do you feel like there's a different appreciation with each individual culture?
For some culture, arts is in part of the culture. I mean, let's talk about the Rio Games, right? In Brazil, their culture, whether it's in arts, in dance, performance, and everything, it's part of their life. And sports was just a way for them to I guess connect among themselves as well. I mean, the football is a huge thing in Brazil, but I mean, as you know, all the Brazilian footballers are great dancers on the pitch as well if they score a goal. But everything is kind of entwined in certain ways. You can't really say. I mean, artists, like we're talking about dancers, you're talking about athletes. They all require a certain amount of discipline and training to get to be experts of their field. And I think there's a lot more in common than differences. And I think if you see it that way, then the opportunities are boundless in terms of what we can do for the Olympic Foundation for Culture and Heritage.
In one of your interviews, you actually mention, as you've just mentioned as well just now, that the Olympics is simply not about just the sport, and rather it allows individuals and oneself to develop themselves, mind and body. How do you feel that the realm of art and culture actually enables this in practice?
I've spoken to quite a few athletes, and a lot of them have told me that for example, music is a big part of their sports training. Listening to music help them to concentrate, help them to relax, playing music, and so on and so forth. So for some of them, they don't really differentiate it as in it's just who they are. I think people these days don't have such clear lines dividing between, as an athlete, that's all I do, as a musician, that's all I do. But I think people see themselves as more well-rounded than that. But I've definitely met a lot of athletes that have other passions outside of their field of play. And that for them makes them complete and help them in their sports as well, because they were saying you can't train 24 hours a day. You have to find different ways of dealing with the kind of stress and the discipline that sports bring you. But at the same time, you also need discipline in other interests as well. Even in music, you need to practice and all. So I think there's a lot of similarities, and in fact, young people, I think for now we realize music is one of the biggest thing that can inspire.
Yeah, I think that's really quite interesting, because maybe more of an appreciation for arts and culture actually enables certain athletes, especially at the Olympics, to maybe enjoy the sport and enjoy the activity that they do, and that they actually appreciate arts and culture maybe almost subconsciously, because they don't even realize how much of an effect it has on them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you go to the athlete village during the games, there's a lot of singing happening. There's a lot of, I mean, it's very celebratory, some of these things. And just because you play different type of sports and doesn't mean you can't come together. And even if you can't speak the same language as well, there will be songs that you're familiar with and you can hum to the tune and all that. So it's quite wonderful to see how the arts can actually bring people together. Yeah.
We would like to ask you just one final question. And it's the final question that we ask literally everyone we interview. And essentially what it is if you could leave young people with just one piece of advice, what would that one piece of advice actually be?
Actually, I did think about it, and I would say is just because you can doesn't mean you should.